I've always wanted to speak here because when I grew up, the primary influence, spiritual influence, was from Swami Ranganathan of the Ramakrishna mission. He was the head in Delhi. And so my parents knew him very well. He used to visit our house when I was a teenager. Since then, and we used to attend his lectures. So, and also Swami Vivekananda's complete works I looked at and referred to all my life. And therefore I'm very glad to be here. My latest book is actually entirely a defense of Swami Vivekananda. The challenge for me is that I'm giving a response to a certain issue that people have raised, that critics have raised. But unfortunately for me, most Vivekananda followers and scholars don't even know of the issue. So it's like asking a doctor telling a patient, I know how to solve that disease, and the patient says, I don't even know what disease you're talking about. So I have double challenge. First I have to explain what the problem is, why it's so serious, even though people aren't aware of it, but it is very serious, and those problems are even more serious. And then what is my response? Now, a lot of you who are tuned into the media and those who are reading books are aware that there is a lot of Indian left critique of Hinduism and of Swami Vivekananda, that this is oppressive, it's hegemonic, it's something artificial, it's something new, it's something made by the British. India is not a nation until the British made it. Hinduism also is a modern construction and full of problems and things like that. But very rarely do I come across somebody who's gone further to see where did this idea originate, who originated it, what was their argument. Because the Indian left and the media who parrot this really do not have the scholarship to have come up with it. They are not really well read in Sanskrit or philosophy or Vivekananda, but they just are regurgitating and cranking out something they've heard, that they've read somewhere else. Now, I have spent the last 14 months researching this issue, and then I wrote a response to this thesis that these people have. I was at a conference of the American Academy of Religion in November 2012. They were discussing my previous book, not this one, but a previous book, where I'm talking about the philosophical difference between Dharma civilization and Western civilization. Intellectually, what are the premises, categories, terms, metaphysics of one and how they differ from the other. A lot of issues like nature of time, the whole idea that many Sanskrit words have no equivalent. For instance, you cannot translate Shraddha, there's no word like that, no experience like that. Or, a word like Shruti, because Shruti, Smriti, difference does not exist in the West. They have different idea of prophet comes and speaks and that's final and closed. So the whole idea that Shruti is rediscovered for each age and Smriti, man-made texts and interpretations go on indefinitely. That doesn't map onto, you cannot call it, if you say Vedas are prophetic, it's not, because they're not, the idea of a prophet is not present in our faith. A prophet is not somebody who has a higher state of consciousness. So Sri Ramakrishna cannot be called a prophet because he didn't say, I'm God speaking to me, told me this to tell you. Prophet is a messenger. It is not a person with a high state of consciousness. And so the Abrahamic religion will in fact tell you that a prophet doesn't have to have any qualifications. They will tell you that a prophet will be whoever God has chosen to please convey my message. He's simply a messenger, that's it. So the whole idea of higher state of consciousness is not required in those faiths. Whereas in our tradition, because the nature of the self is Satchitanand, higher state of consciousness is everything that we are trying to deal with. So our spiritual exemplars are not the same kind as the Prophet. So you can go on and I did that whole book on what are the distinctive characteristics of our civilization. Not that one is better than the other, but what is different. It's like, you know, an apple is not the same as a banana. Not that one is better than the other, but they are not the same. So there was this panel discussion dedicated to my book with top Western scholars, one Indian, some Westerners, to each giving their commentary on my book. And the surprising thing is, they were very troubled by the feeling, by the fact that it reminded them of Vivekananda's ideas of Hinduism. And they accused me of basically using Vivekananda's philosophy to position Dharma and then use that to discuss whatever I was discussing. I had never seen it that way, but they in fact got me interested in this issue. So I said, what is there about Vivekananda that troubles you so much? And therefore, by linking my book to Vivekananda, which I consider to be an honor, by linking my book to Vivekananda, you are raising these issues. And in the discussion, what came out is, all of them felt that there was really no such thing as Hinduism until Vivekananda fabricated it. One of them written a book called Was Hinduism Manufactured? Their thesis, which they call Neo-Hinduism thesis, goes as follows. Until Vivekananda, Indians had inferiority complex with respect to the British, because British had science, British were very charitable, Indians didn't have charity, all kind of inferiority complexes. So Vivekananda wanted to create national unity and a positive identity by copying good ideas from the British and from Christianity, putting them into Indian terms and making it sound like it is our religion. So the theory goes that Karma Yoga did not exist before. The Christians have charity to help each other, and he wanted to introduce this into India, so he called it Karma Yoga. The word Karma Yoga in the Gita has a different meaning. It is about individual moksha, not helping other people. So the Gita's idea of moksha is, of Karma Yoga is what I do for my own moksha. Christian idea is I help other people. So the claim goes that Swami Vivekananda just took this Christian idea and called it Karma Yoga, but it's not authentic. Now, just to take this one example, Swami Vivekananda used the term Tattvamasi as the basis for ethics. You are that. Since you and I are the same, and we are both forms of divine, so I love you, I have compassion for you. That's the philosophy. Now this is a very old philosophy, but the people on the other side of the argument, their view is that Swami Vivekananda copied Tattvamasi from Paul Deussen, who was a well-known German Sanskrit scholar, one of the top students of Schopenhauer, who was also a well-known, Indian philosophy expert. Schopenhauer did not know Sanskrit. He studied philosophy, Indian philosophy through secondary translations, and his student Paul Deussen became a Sanskrit scholar and went deeper. And indeed, Paul Deussen did use the term Tattvamasi ethics. And he gave a lecture in Bombay, and Swami Vivekananda, according to the people on the other side of this debate, Swami Vivekananda was listening to this lecture in Bombay, and therefore he got the idea of Tattvamasi from Deussen. And because Deussen is a Christian, therefore he got a Christian idea, brought it into India and called it Hinduism. Now I looked at Deussen's works on Tattvamasi. Actually, Deussen is criticizing Christianity, saying that Christian love for your neighbor, help your neighbor, there is no philosophical, metaphysical basis for it within Christian thought. Why should I love my neighbor? The fact that I'm told to love my neighbor is a command. I'm obeying the command of God. But what's the philosophical reason? And because he is just created by God, I'm created by God, why do I have to love him? God loves him enough. God can do these things for him. And he says that only by introducing the notion of Tattvamasi, that we are divine, only then you can have this idea of true love for other people. And this notion of Tattvamasi is missing in the Bible, missing in Christianity. So Deussen is actually criticizing Christianity's deficiency and proposing that they should fill this deficiency by borrowing this idea from the Vedas, Tattvamasi. However, when Vivekananda uses, it's okay that they want to borrow this idea. I have no problem with that. They want to borrow this Vedic idea into Christianity. But when Vivekananda uses this as his philosophy of Karma Yoga, helping other people, he's accused of taking Christian idea. Which means that they borrowed something from us, and then when we use it, we're accused of taking something of theirs. So it's a very strange kind of situation. So in this manner, I've gone through a lot of the ideas which the people have developed into a thesis called Neo-Hinduism, that there is no such really religion as Hinduism. It's a political construction. It's not even a faith. It never existed before the British. And all these ideas are fabricated. So the idea of Karma Yoga, I gave you example. Then, probably the central argument they have is that Advait Vedant of Adi Shankara is not compatible with yoga. And for Swamiji it's very important. For Swamiji it's very important that there are different paths to moksha. And so the argument they're giving is that Advait Vedanta idea of yoga, idea of moksha is such that you cannot achieve moksha through yoga. This is the argument they're giving. And they're quoting Shankara and trying to show that Vivekananda is ignorant of Advait philosophy. His interpretation of Advait is wrong. And they're quoting Shankara to make that point. Now there is a lot of merit in what those people are saying. I will explain to you what it is. It's not a trivial objection. It's a very serious argument. And we have to give it the respect it deserves and then give a response. The argument they have is that Advait Vedanta says that the whole cosmos is causation, cause, effect, karma, phal. Every karma has a phal, and everything that exists is the effect of some cause. So microphone has some cause that created the microphone. Every action I do creates some effect. So the whole cosmos is a web of cause-effect, causation, and all knowledge that we have of this is, causation, knowledge of causation. The only thing outside causation is Brahman, and Brahman is not the effect of anything. You cannot cause Brahman to happen. So you cannot do something whose effect will be Brahman. This is all true. And moksha, as the state of existence as Brahman, Aham Brahmasmi, moksha cannot be the effect of a cause. I cannot do something, I cannot do a karma and get moksha. Because every karma will produce a phal which is within causation. So since everything I can do has an effect within causation, I can do good things and get good effects. I can do bad things and get bad effects. But there's nothing I can do whose effect will be moksha, because moksha is the state beyond causation and therefore it cannot be caused. This is a good argument. It's not a foolish argument. It's not, this is an argument that Adi Shankara gives in his critiques, in his analysis. Now, therefore, they say that since yoga is something you do, the person is doing yoga, he's doing sadhana, he's doing tapas, he's doing, the dhyan, he's doing samadhi, he's doing something to get there. Therefore, whatever effect is produced is not moksha. So samadhi is not moksha. That is the thesis, that moksha cannot be caused by something you do, because whatever you do will produce an effect within the same web of causation. So the system of Adi Shankara was Shravanam, Mananan and Nididhyasana. The first is that you hear from a qualified teacher, you understand, Shruti, then you, Mananan is you intellectualize, you debate, you argue, you reason, you rationalize, you try to understand it logically, analytically, and then the third one, Nididhyasana, is the practice. Then you get to moksha. Now, Shankara didn't write too much on the third one. He wrote some texts, but not too much. Much of his writings are debates with opponents. So he's debating with Sankhya and he's debating with Buddhists. These are the two opponents he's debating with. So, you cannot take all the arguments of Shankara and assume that they apply in our situation, because his arguments were for a particular kind of opponent that he was debating. After Shankara, many of the Shankaracharyas of Sringeri and other mathas set up by him have expanded the interpretation of Advaita Vedanta to include yoga, because they are saying that while at the level of ego, the yogi is doing something. So Rajiv is doing something. I want to live sattvic and have some good effects. Okay, I'm doing. The sense of doer is there. But the argument they've made that at a certain stage, letting go, surrender, letting go, dissolving the ego, all of you are familiar with this idea, leads to a state where there is a non-doer action. So moksha comes about with the non-doer action, and therefore since there is no doer doing the action, there is no phalla, because phalla is only when there is somebody who's doing it. Phalla is not because there is an action. If there is a doerless action, there is no phalla from that. So this argument which the other people have given that yoga and Vedanta are incompatible by citing Shankara is out of context. It is in the context of Shankara's writings while debating Buddhists, and it is superseded by subsequent writings of his own lineage. And so Vivekananda taps into that. But these critics say that Vivekananda got these ideas from British people. He plagiarized a lot of British ideas and Christian ideas and came up with these new things. And hence they feel that the unity, a unified thing called Hinduism is not viable, because it's full of contradictions, like Vedanta and yoga cannot be. Like Karma yoga has nothing to do with helping others. So they've come up with every little part of Vivekananda's philosophy, bhakti, they've done the same. They've critiqued the main ideas of Swami Vivekananda and tried to show that there is contradiction, that he just put it quickly together to impress ignorant people. But if you look at it in a deep way, it violates all the shastras of Hinduism, or of our classical thought. And therefore, Hinduism as a construct by Vivekananda is not a valid construct. It's a hodgepodge manufactured for political motives, nothing else. And therefore, the sooner you get rid of it, the faster you can liberate Indian people, because it is the cause of all kinds of turmoil, distress, fights, oppression of minorities and whatnot. So there's a political spin. Now, I wanted to understand what is this parampara, who came up with all this, because I want to understand it. So I've spent the last 14 months, must have read maybe 50, 75 major treatises, PhD dissertations, heavy philosophical books from this parampara. The first person who coins the term Neo-Hinduism is a man called Paul Hacker in Germany. He, in the 1950s, until then the word Neo-Hinduism had not existed. There was a word Neo-Vedanta, which even Swami Vivekananda used. That's a different word. We're not referring to that. That's just Vedanta's own interpretations, new interpretations. But Neo-Hinduism as a word is suddenly coined in the 1950s by Paul Hacker. And Paul Hacker is a well-known, very accomplished Sanskrit philosopher, Sanskrit scholar, philologist and so on. And he comes up with this idea that Hinduism is an artificial construction and not a valid construction, and the culprit who did it is Vivekananda, and he writes 10 articles, long, big articles and papers, they're widely published, and trying to each of those papers picks up some aspect of Swamiji's works and tries to take it apart as not authentic, and he assigns a motive of nationalism and politics, and Swamiji had an inferiority complex that Indians are weaker than the British, so he wanted to take all those ideas and put it into Indian terms. So that's his thesis. And then Halifax, who is in the University of Pennsylvania in the US, he invites Hacker on lecture tours, gives him a visiting professorship to promote him. So he gets promoted in the US among Indologists in the 50s. And then Aghihanand Bharati, some of you might know, he was a Viennese who became a sannyasi in India, took sannyas. He actually had some dealings with Ramakrishna mission also for a while. Swami Harshanand Maharaj was telling me that he had dealings with Ramakrishna mission, then for whatever reason he had a fight or something, he left. So he had a period of being a sannyasi, wearing orange robes, having a Hindu name, and he wrote a book called The Ochre Robe. Ochre is the color, describing his life as a sannyasi. And he was into Tantra, he was into many things. And then he went back to Europe, rejected and discarded Hinduism, and he joined this Neo-Hinduism parampara. He started propagating these ideas. He coined the term pizza effect, and he said Hinduism is a pizza effect. Pizza, it was a poor man's food in Italy. The rich elite did not eat pizza, it was for peasants, until Pizza Hut turned it into international cuisine. So once Pizza Hut takes the pizza into the whole world, they also make it more fancy with more toppings, and then the Italians are very proud of their pizza, and all the Italians start eating pizza because they're very proud. So Pizza Hut has made the Italians proud of pizza, and the Italians have borrowed this new kind of pizza, neo-pizza, it's not the real pizza. So similarly he says, British, in order to rule India, had come up with simplified, standardized ideas of religions, and they compiled this Hinduism just for the sake of governing them, governing the Indians. And they also wanted to respect the Indians. They gave it a romantic spin. It was really not true. Those were not really the true things, but they kind of made it very clean and philosophical and put a Vedanta philosophy on the top and so on. And so, just like what Pizza Hut did for the simple pizza, the British did for Dharma, our Dharmas. And just like the Italians became very proud of this Pizza Hut variety and said this is ours, same way a very inferiority complex person, Vivekananda, took this British romanticized Hinduism and said this is ours, and then he embellished it further. He added all this Raj Yoga, calling it science, and added this Karma Yoga, and so he basically seized a very idealized, cleaned up, kind of simplified idea of Hinduism from the British and embellished it further and brought it back. So it's called a pizza effect. So that was Aghihanand Bharati's contribution. And then a woman in England known as Ursula King, who's an Anglican church minister, but for all her life she's been studying Hinduism and knows the Sanskrit classics and texts and writes a lot about it. She took this idea further, and she's the one who said that this Neo-Hinduism is politically dangerous because it's been taken over by political people now after Vivekananda, and so the way to get rid of this political Hinduism today is to expose Vivekananda having committed kind of a fraud, that he just made this up. And then there is a huge, big event in this parampara, because an Indian claiming to be Hindu, and a very prominent Indian today, very big ambassador of Hinduism all over the world, he becomes Ursula King's PhD student, goes to England, gets his PhD, and his name is Anand Ram Bachchan. He is originally from the Caribbean, and this was in 1980s, early 80s. He got his PhD in England, and the PhD was on proving that Vivekananda's Karma Yoga, Gyan Yoga, Raj Yoga, Bhakti Yoga cannot lead to moksha, according to Chakra, and therefore the whole life work of Vivekananda is just a sham. This is his PhD thesis, and since then he's produced many works similarly. Very philosophical. He will never say it in an insulting way. He'll say it in a very polite way. He'll say that we respect Vivekananda as a great man, but the ideas are not good, that sort of thing. So he wrote this, and within months, an echo started in India, which is the next chapter of this story. The first person in India to take up this topic was Thaper, at that time a much younger person. In the early 80s, he wrote a very influential article called Syndicated Moksha, which says that Hinduism is a syndicate. There's a syndicate of political people who fabricated this, and this is called Hinduism. And she quotes these Western people. She has not done the scholarship like these. Paul Hacker, at least he's done scholarship. Ursula King, at least she's done scholarship. Ram Bachchan, he's a solid scholar. He's really well informed about the text and trying to find little things to make his point. But Ramana Thaper doesn't know Sanskrit, doesn't know Indian philosophy, basically just quoting these people. And she unleashes a whole avalanche of Indian thinkers, writers, leftists, giving this spin on Hinduism. So today you see when Vivekananda's 150th anniversary was celebrated, Jyotirmay Sharma writes a book on Hindutva and Hinduism and Vivekananda. The whole thing is a political sham, political construction, brilliant political construction, but no spiritual validity. That's his point of view. Pankaj Mishra writes the same way in UK and various parts of the world. New York Times, he's a bestseller. Then there's a lot of such writers who go around saying that Hinduism is just a recent construction. What they're implying but not saying is that Vivekananda did it. And a corollary to this recently invented Hinduism thesis is that India is a recent construction by the British because there's nothing unifying, no unifying idea of India. So this is what I set out to discover, and this is what preoccupied me full time from morning till night, 7 days a week, ever since I discovered all this, to understand it more deeply and come up with my own ideas, arguments. And the book Indra's Net, subtitle is Defending Hinduism's Philosophical Unity. This book is a response to the people who have come up with this neo-Hinduism thesis. So I've gone to much earlier texts and shown that the unity that Vivekananda discussed and taught had existed long before the British colonialists. I've quoted many earlier authors who combined these things, who combined the bhakti and the karma and Raj Yoga and Vedanta. These ideas have existed. Swami Vivekananda put it in a modern context, in a modern vernacular, for a modern situation, and in our tradition you update knowledge. That is why smritis are different than shruti. We keep updating the way we're explaining something, but the knowledge is already there. So I have given a whole response. The book has two parts. Purva Paksh, which is taking each of those primary thinkers of that neo-Hinduism thesis. I have separate chapters on that, explaining what they're saying. And then Uttar Paksh is part 2, which is my response. So that is as far as that book is concerned. The structure is concerned. The title, Indra's Net, comes from Atharva Ved, Indrajal. And Indrajal is a metaphor for unity and interconnectivity. Indrajal is described as the whole cosmos is a net of jewels, infinitely spreading in every direction. Each jewel is a reflection of all the other jewels. So you look in one jewel, you see all the other jewels. So every little electron has got the whole cosmos inside it. Every little ant has got the whole universe inside it. That's our philosophy. Everything contains everything else. The body is a map of the macrocosm, microcosm mapping. And so this is a very beautiful metaphor for interconnectivity. And I use this as a metaphor to show that not only the interconnectivity of the universe, but interconnectivity of knowledge, interconnectivity of paths, different paths that Swami Vivekananda proposed, that our Dharma has different paths. So this is why this is how I came up with this title. Now, the second, so unity of Hinduism and continuity with the past is one theme of this book, which is defending Vivekananda. Related to this is, the question, what is India's narrative? What is the grand narrative of India? Every nation has a grand narrative, big story about who we are, where we came from, our itihas, our past, our present, where are we going, what's our vision. So you see, America has a grand narrative which starts with the founding fathers of America. Every child is taught the flag, the anthem. Before that, Europe, ancestors were Europeans. They take it all the way back to Jerusalem, Greece, Rome. That is where the narrative starts. And then there is the West, the Europe, and then America is the climax. And Americans give the name to their narrative. It's called American exceptionalism. American exceptionalism means we are the #1 people in the world. So there's a narrative the whole country knows. And whether you are left-wing, right-wing, doesn't matter. You subscribe to this narrative. You're taught from childhood. China has a grand narrative based on the uniformity of Mandarin language and the idea that they are Confucian people. Confucius is their main thinker in the old times. And so when the Chinese adopt modernization, they're not westernizing. Chinese are very clear. They want you to know we are modernizing, we are not westernizing. So the question is, can India modernize without westernizing? Okay? And in the case of China, they have this idea that when we modernize, we are in consistency with Confucian thought. So we're taking our old Confucian thought and using new science technology, updating it. We're not disconnecting from our own tradition. We're not westernizing. The similar thing for India would be to say, okay, we are connected with Dharma, we are connected with our roots, and we are having modern Dharma. We are modernizing within Dharma, and we are not westernizing. We are moving forward, and we have a whole history of innovation, science, technology, mathematics, astronomy, chemistry, metallurgy, whatever, medicine, textiles. We have a whole history of progress in the outer world. And so now we are going to progress again, but that doesn't mean we are losing the sense of who we are. So this narrative would have to be put together and adopted as a national narrative, but it doesn't exist right now. There's no consensus for it. Japan has a consensus for its narrative. They're a homogeneous people, and everybody is very clear about what it means to be Japanese. There's no embarrassment. You don't have to say, okay, I'm secular, I can't be Japanese. Russians are not embarrassed that they are Russian. They're very clear. A French person is very clear why French is different. French civilization is different than English, different than German. So most major successful nations have a grand narrative. So the question this raises is, what is the Indian grand narrative? What is Indian grand narrative? Is it Maoism? Maoism is a grand narrative of India, which says it's class struggle, Marxism, Maoism, it's exploitation. Every one of these groups has its own identity, its own history. They've been exploited. They should fight to overthrow the state. So there is a narrative like that. There is a narrative that the Jinnah had. Jinnah had that it should be returned. British should return it back to the Mughal time, Mughal idea. Return back to the Mughal idea. That should be the narrative of India. In fact, he wanted that if there is to be a West Pakistan and East Pakistan, there should be a connecting corridor, which means all through North India that should be part of Pakistan. So it's a contiguous state. So there is that competing narrative. They've never given up on that being the narrative they want for all of South Asia. They still claim that that's the narrative. So there is an evangelical missionary narrative wherever there are pockets of poor people where they are converting in a very large way. They are promoting a narrative which says your traditional narrative has failed and we got a new narrative. It's a better narrative, gives you better rights, better progress, and so on and so forth. So these are competing narratives of India that many different people have proposed. Some are from outside, some are from within, and there are various alliances and collaborations among these narratives. But where is the pan-Indian grand narrative? What is the grand narrative? To have a thriving nation, unified nation, we keep talking about superpower and all that, but without a consensus of what is our narrative, and this consensus has to include everybody, and it has to be taught, there has to be museums, there has to be celebration of this narrative. Without such a narrative, there is really no nation. You cannot just say there is a nation because we have a cricket team and we have Bhangra or whatever, Bollywood. That's pop culture, and that's good, it's nice to have, but you don't really have a strong, deep, committed narrative with just pop culture. You need to have all the narrative examples I gave you of various countries are based in an ancient unity of who we are, a kind of a large story, a large itihas kind of thing they have, from which we have evolved and come, and we are going together forward. So when you discuss this in India, you get very uncomfortable reactions. India is the only place where people are very uncomfortable about being asked what does it mean to be an Indian, what is the grand narrative. I was invited to the Indian Foreign Service Institute, where they have young foreign service recruits, to give a talk on India and the dialogue of civilizations. Where does India fit? So I was talking about what should be the Indian grand narrative, and they're very uncomfortable. Why do we need a grand narrative? We don't need a grand narrative. The narrative would oppress Dalits. This kind of a very anxiety about being Indian and have a unified sense. Very, very strange. I don't find this talking to Chinese. They're not worried about, somebody will call them chauvinistic or something. I don't find the French having a concern that if we proudly present our French history and narrative that we'll be called chauvinistic. Certainly Americans are not afraid of being very proud of their heritage. I don't find this anywhere else, except I find it in India. In 2005, there was a World Sanskrit Congress in Thailand, created by the Crown Princess, the king's daughter, and they were looking for an Indian sponsorship, and nobody in India wanted to sponsor. The government didn't want to sponsor, and so the person who was in charge of finding the Indian collaborator called me and said, "Would your Infinity Foundation please sponsor it, because otherwise we'll have embarrassment that no Indian wants to be sponsoring the Sanskrit Congress." So I told him I'm a small little foundation, I don't have the resources, and the Crown Princess represents a whole royal family, I can't match that. And he said, you don't have to match it, it's just symbolic, just give a small amount of money and you'll be the co-convener. So I agreed, and we wrote an MOU that the Crown Princess and I will co-convene, and this was packaged in Thailand as Indian sponsor, even though I'm living in the US. I have nothing to do with the Indian government, I'm a private guy. But at least they said we'll save face, So a month before the event, this Indian professor who's putting this together calls me with a lot of panic and says, there's trouble. Now the HRD minister wants to come and he wants to replace you, he wants to be the convener. Because suddenly they realize this thing is going to be very big, it's going to become a big international event, there's all these scholars and media, everybody coming, and so he wants to come and be the ribbon cutting and stand there and do all those things. And I said, how can you throw me out? I have done all this work, I have a written MOU. He says there's a lot of pressure on me, they'll throw me in jail, they'll say, why did you create this problem? Who gave you permission to do all this? Previously nobody wanted to be involved, now they will accuse me. So please help me out. So I said, I cannot be thrown out. I've invested time, energy, my mind, vision, everything. So it was decided that there'll be 3 co-conveners. There'll be the Crown Princess, myself and the HRD minister, 3 of us. And when the event was over, to a huge success, the Crown Princess sat through 3 days of hearings, proceedings, talks, papers, discussions. Every minute she was there, very clued in, and she has a personal tutor who teaches her Sanskrit. Her 2 sons she sent to Tirupati University to learn Sanskrit, because she thinks that is part of their grand narrative. The Ramayana is part of their national grand narrative. Sanskrit is part of their national narrative. All these ASEAN countries feel that way. Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, Indonesia, even the 98% who are Muslims in Indonesia, only Bali is Hindu, the other side Muslim. Even the Muslims have names like Ram and Sita, and they feel that their ancestry is Indian, and that is part of the history they have not erased. They don't want to erase it, they're very proud of it. They became Muslims, but they did not change their heritage. So In this Thailand conference, when it was over, on the last day, the Indian embassy realizes this, this is a big deal, something very international has happened and we should be getting something out of it. So they decided to throw a big dinner reception for all the dignitaries, get press and everything. Suddenly they wanted to appropriate it, co-opt it, like, we are part of it. So when they were having this event, I was asking the Indian Foreign Service young people at this event, what is India's strategy to promote Sanskriti in this part of the world where they think that it's their mother civilization. Like Europeans think it's Greece is the mother civilization. These people think it's India and our Sanskriti, our civilization is their mother. What is your strategy to promote this here so that you have diplomatic, it will help you diplomatically? These people knew nothing about it. They had no interest, no knowledge. In fact, their question was, sir, we are secular, how can we do this? This kind of an attitude, very defeatist kind of an attitude. So, I found that the foreign service people, IAS people, all the Indian diplomats I see overseas, I see all the Indian writers who get all these awards at the Jaipur Film Festival, Jaipur Literary Festival, media people, they're very hopeless when it comes to a deep knowledge of Indian grand narrative. Whereas if you see an educated, well-educated American, he'll know the classics, he'll know the Western classics, he'll be very proud. You go to any university, you go to Princeton, Harvard, Yale, Stanford, and you look up classics department. It's a nice department, big building. They are very proud. This is who we are. These classics, what we'll say, Shastras, Itihas, that would be our classics. This is who we are. We're very proud of it. The Institute of Culture here is a great example of trying to promote our grand narrative in a sense. But you do not see this. You do not see Indians embracing this in the same way that other civilizations embrace theirs, because we've been sold a very warped idea of what it means to be modern and what it means to be progressive and what it means to be secular, and it has come at the expense of disowning some of our own selves. So the Indian grand narrative, when you ask the question, it raises a lot of issues. I gave a talk in Delhi when people were ready to attack me. How can you talk about such a thing as Indian grand narrative? Don't you know we've been oppressing these people for all this? Why? So I said, okay, then give up India. Then you just say my narrative is there should not be a nation. Give it up, abandon it, anarchy. Fine. At least be consistent. You cannot go around saying I'm a very proud Indian and I have this 9% growth rate forecast and I think that we are going to be a great nation. You cannot say all that and then not have a narrative. Because you need to know who you are who are you defending? These Indian Foreign Service people, I said, who is the India that you're defending? If you do not know the answer to that, how are you going to do your job? It will be so easy to bring you down in a negotiation or in an argument or in a fight, because at the end of the day you're weak. Somebody else has given you an idea of India and you've basically believed what their idea is because you don't have your own. So this is a very serious issue. And the book discusses that also. Then, one of the things I'm very concerned about, and I'll stop in a few minutes and take questions. One of the things I'm very concerned about happening, and especially in the case of Vivekananda, is that a lot of our icons and a lot of our ideas are being digested. By digestion, I mean that West is taking over these ideas, repackaging them as their own with new terminology, new ideology, new framework, and we lose the essence, we lose the meaning, it sometimes gets distorted and the source is lost, the source is disowned. So a lot of Swami Vivekananda ideas have become recontextualized as Western. Some of them have become Christian ideas. Some of them are Western science or Western secular ideas. But the relevance of Swami Vivekananda has gone down in the West in the last 50, 75 years. In the Ramakrishna mission centers in the US, a couple of generations ago, they used to have a lot of young people come to learn meditation because it's something they didn't have. Now they go to the church to learn meditation. In fact, I asked, why are your places empty? Yeah, I lived there 43 years. I've asked some Ramakrishna mission people and they get very honest in saying that we do not offer something we don't have. So I say, well, what is it that you used to offer at one time? So they begin to think, we used to offer things which they learned and incorporated, we don't have it. So there's no reason to come here. So that's an example of being digested. Now, I don't think it's inevitable. In fact, this book gives good antidotes on what is non-digestible, what is there about us, which if we hang on to, cannot be digested. The authenticity, original version has to be preserved. One of the things that's non-digestible are certain Sanskrit words. You know, there are certain Sanskrit words we should not replace with equivalent English or whatever is closest English, because in doing so we're losing our heritage. We're making the Sanskrit kind of obsolete, irrelevant, not necessary, because it's been replaced by something else. So whether it is terminology, whether it is practices, whether it is symbols, whether it is gurus, whether it is pilgrim centers, sacred sites, those are not replaceable with something else. So we are close with this because it's actually the topic of digestion takes me off on a whole different track. But I rather have time so we can have questions. Thank you very much for listening. I'd love to address your questions now.